Daniel Morrison's signature froze mid-stroke across the acquisition papers, his Mont Blanc pen hovering motionless above documents worth $50 million. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 40th floor office, he could see a small figure in the plaza below, a child standing alone in the rain, clutching something against her chest like a lifeline. The little girl wasn't seeking shelter or running for cover like every sensible person caught in Chicago's autumn downpour. Frank Rodriguez, the building's head of security, burst through Daniel's office doors without knocking, his weathered face pale with something between disbelief and admiration. "Mr. Morrison, sir, there's a situation downstairs. That kid's been standing out there for 4 hours straight, asking every person who walks by the same thing." Daniel's assistant, Helen, pressed her hand to her throat as she watched from the window, her voice barely a whisper. "She can't be more than 7 years old." Dear God, where are her parents? The scene below transformed the sterile corporate environment into something raw and desperate, a child's unwavering faith colliding with an indifferent world. "Call building management," Daniel commanded, though his eyes never left the small figure below. "Find out what she wants. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, Daniel Morrison had stood in the same office celebrating his company's latest acquisition, a healthcare technology firm that promised to revolutionize patient data management. The champagne had tasted like victory then, but now the empty bottles in his penthouse trash served as hollow reminders of celebrations shared with no one. At 45, Daniel commanded a tech empire worth $2.8 billion, built from the ashes of a childhood that had taught him that survival meant never depending on anyone else. Morrison Digital Solutions occupied 12 floors of Chicago's most prestigious business district, its glass walls reflecting a city that had watched him transform from an 8-year-old orphan into America's most ruthless tech mogul. The car crash that killed his parents had left more than physical scars. It had carved out his capacity for trust, replacing it with an obsession for control and accumulation. His penthouse on the 40th floor showcased everything money could buy and nothing money couldn't. Italian marble floors stretched beneath Scandinavian furniture that had never been sat on by friends because Daniel Morrison didn't have friends. He had business associates, board members, and competitors. The walls displayed awards and stock certificates instead of family photos, professional achievements instead of personal memories. His refrigerator contained protein shakes and takeout containers. His medicine cabinet held prescription sleep aids, and his contacts list had 847 numbers, but no one who would notice if he didn't answer his phone for a week. Every morning at 5 a.m., Daniel followed the same ritual that had built his fortune. Black coffee, financial reports, workout routine that felt more like punishment than self-care. His assistant Helen had worked for him for 8 years and still called him Mr. Morrison. His housekeeper came twice weekly to clean rooms he barely lived in. His driver knew his schedule better than his personal preferences because Daniel Morrison didn't have personal preferences, only strategic advantages. The foster care system had taught him that attachment led to abandonment, that caring meant eventual loss. So he'd built walls higher than his skyscrapers, surrounding himself with employees who respected his intellect, competitors who feared his ruthlessness, and board members who valued his results. But respect, fear, and value weren't warmth on cold Chicago nights when the lake winds rattled windows of his empty fortress. Success had become his identity, wealth his worth, and isolation his protection. He ate dinner alone every night, usually while reviewing quarterly projections, his phone silently charging on the counter because no one called Daniel Morrison after business hours unless the stock market was crashing. Weekends meant longer office hours, holidays meant strategic planning sessions, and birthdays meant nothing at all because there was no one left who remembered the scared little boy who used to wish on birthday candles for a family that would never leave him. Daniel Morrison had everything the American dream promised, except someone to share it with, someone who cared whether he came home, or someone who would mourn him when the empire he'd built became someone else's legacy. Daniel's usual driver had called in sick with the flu, forcing him to navigate Chicago streets on foot for the first time in months. The October rain fell in sheets across the financial district, turning sidewalks into rivers and sending pedestrians scurrying for shelter under awnings and into lobbies. His Italian leather shoes, designed for boardrooms rather than puddles, were already soaked through by the time he reached the plaza outside Morrison Tower. That's when he saw her, a small figure standing motionless in the downpour, her thin jacket plastered against her tiny frame. While everyone else fled the weather, this child stood her ground with the determination of someone who had nowhere else to go. Her dark hair hung in wet strands around a face that looked far too serious for someone who couldn't be older than 7. "Please, sir, I just need to ask one of the rich people for help," she was saying to Frank Rodriguez, the building's head of security. Frank, a Vietnam veteran who'd worked the building for 15 years, knelt down to her level, his weathered face creased with concern and frustration. "Sweetheart, you can't just stand out here in the rain," Frank said gently but firmly. "Where's your mama? Where's your family?" The little girl clutched a crumpled dollar bill in one hand and what appeared to be a piece of paper in the other. "My mama's at home with my baby brother. He's sick and needs medicine, but we don't have enough money. I calculated that if I ask 10 rich people for $12.70 each, I can buy Tommy's medicine before the pharmacy closes." Daniel stopped walking. Something about her mathematical precision struck him as both heartbreaking and remarkable. Most adults couldn't calculate percentages in their heads, yet this child had figured out exactly how to divide her problem into manageable pieces. "I've already asked 9 people," she continued, her voice carrying the kind of matter-of-fact desperation that comes from having no other options. "You're my last chance, mister. The pharmacy closes at 8 o'clock, and Tommy needs his medicine tonight or he'll have trouble breathing." Frank looked up and noticed Daniel standing there, his expensive suit marking him as exactly the kind of person this child was seeking. "Mr. Morrison, maybe you could—" Frank began, but Daniel was already moving closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. "What's that in your hand?" Daniel asked, nodding toward the paper the girl clutched alongside her dollar bill. She looked up at him with eyes that held a startling combination of hope and resignation. "It's a contract, sir. I promise to pay you back when I grow up and get a good job. I even calculated 3% interest because I learned about that on the financial news my mama watches while she works night shifts." Daniel took the soggy piece of paper she offered. Written in careful 7-year-old handwriting was the most earnest legal document he'd ever seen. "I, Emma Carter, promise to pay back every penny plus 3% interest to the nice man who helps my brother Tommy get better. I will pay you back when I am 25 years old and have a good job. I will also say thank you every day until then. Signed, Emma Carter, age 7." The contract was decorated with small drawings of hearts and flowers, and at the bottom she'd attempted to create an official-looking seal using what appeared to be a bottle cap dipped in crayon wax. "I don't take money from people without giving them something back," Emma explained seriously. "My mama taught me that everything has a price and you always have to pay what you owe." Daniel found himself studying this child who spoke about interest rates and contracts while shivering in clothes that had seen better days. Her sneakers had holes that let in the rain, and her jacket was at least 2 sizes too small, but her posture radiated dignity. She wasn't begging, she was proposing a business transaction. "How do you know I'm rich?" Daniel asked. "Because you're wearing a really nice suit, and you came out of the tallest, fanciest building in the whole city. Plus, you have that look that rich people have, like you're not worried about money." Frank chuckled despite himself. "Kid's got you figured out, Mr. Morrison." "What's your brother's name?" Daniel asked. "Tommy. He's only 18 months old and he has trouble breathing sometimes." The doctor gave us medicine, but it costs $127, and Mama only has $83 after paying rent. I've been standing here since 3 o'clock asking people to help us make up the difference. 4 hours. This child had been standing in the rain for 4 hours, approaching strangers and maintaining hope despite repeated rejection. Daniel felt something crack inside his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his own childhood, when he'd stood outside social services offices promising caseworkers he'd be good if they'd just let him stay in one home. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, staring down at Emma's handwritten contract while rain continued to soak through his expensive suit. The child's earnest face looked up at him with a mixture of desperate hope and resigned preparation for another rejection. Her mathematical precision about the pharmacy's closing time and her careful calculation of what she needed struck him as both heartbreaking and extraordinary. "Where's the pharmacy?" he heard himself ask, surprising both Frank and Emma. Emma's eyes widened with cautious optimism. "It's 6 blocks away on Ashland Avenue. But I don't have a car, and Mama says I can't take the bus by myself after dark." Without fully understanding his own motivations, Daniel found himself walking toward the parking garage with Emma following beside him, her small legs working double time to keep up with his long strides. Frank called after them, "Mr. Morrison, are you sure about this?" Daniel wasn't sure about anything, but something about Emma's unwavering determination to save her brother had cracked through 40 years of carefully constructed emotional barriers. He helped her into his Tesla Model S, watching her wonder at the heated leather seats and silent engine startup. "This car doesn't make any noise," Emma observed, settling into the passenger seat and carefully buckling her seatbelt. "Is it broken?" "It's electric," Daniel explained, pulling out of the garage into Chicago traffic. "No gas engine." "That's really smart. Gas costs a lot of money. Mama always says we can't drive places because gas is too expensive." She spoke about poverty with the matter-of-fact acceptance that broke Daniel's heart. "Is this car expensive?" Daniel glanced at the child, who had no idea she was sitting in a vehicle worth more than most people's annual salary. "It cost about as much as your brother's medicine would cost for 10 years. Emma's eyes grew round. "Wow, you must be really, really rich." "That's good, because rich people can help more people." The innocence of her logic, that wealth existed to help others, stood in stark contrast to everything Daniel had learned about money during his rise to the top. In his world, wealth was accumulated for power, leverage, and security. The concept of using it primarily to help others seemed as foreign as Emma's absolute faith in humanity's basic goodness. During the drive through Chicago's South Side, Emma provided a tour guide's commentary that revealed her world with painful clarity. "That's where we go for free dinner on Tuesdays," she said, pointing to a community center. "The volunteers are really nice, but they always look sad when they see kids without their daddies." "Where's your daddy?" Daniel asked gently. "He went to heaven when Tommy was still in Mama's tummy." "He got sick like Tommy, but we didn't have money for his medicine either." She said this without self-pity, as if loss was simply another fact to be navigated. They passed boarded-up buildings, homeless encampments under highway overpasses, and a soup kitchen with a line stretching around the block despite the rain. Daniel realized he'd never seen this part of his city, the Chicago that existed in the shadows of his glass towers and gated communities. "That's Mrs. Rodriguez's house," Emma continued, pointing to a small apartment building. "She sometimes gives us rice and beans when Mama works late. And that's where the mean dog lives. He barks really loud, but I think he's just lonely like the old man who owns him." When they reached Wellington Pharmacy, Emma's excitement was palpable. She practically bounced out of the car, clutching her dollar bill and contract as she pushed through the door with Daniel following behind. The pharmacist, an elderly Asian woman whose name tag read Mrs. Chen, looked up with recognition and genuine warmth. "Emma, you're back? Did you find someone to help with Tommy's medicine?" "This is Mr. Daniel," Emma announced proudly. "He's going to lend me the money, and I'm going to pay him back when I grow up and get a good job." Mrs. Chen's expression shifted to one of profound sadness, mixed with admiration as she looked at Daniel. "This little angel comes here every week counting pennies and asking if we have free samples. Last month she offered to sweep the entire store in exchange for Tommy's prescription. I've been a pharmacist for 30 years and I've never met a more determined child." The reality of Emma's situation hit Daniel like a physical blow. While he'd been accumulating billions in abstract numbers on computer screens, this 7-year-old had been literally counting pennies, trying to keep her baby brother alive. "How much is the medicine?" Daniel asked, pulling out his wallet. $127 for a week's supply, Mrs. Chen replied. "Without insurance, well, it's impossible for families like Emma's." Daniel handed over his credit card without hesitation, but Emma immediately tugged on his sleeve. "Wait! You have to let me sign the contract first. I can't take your money until you agree to let me pay you back." She pulled out a crayon from her pocket and carefully wrote Daniel's name at the bottom of her homemade contract, then handed him the crayon expectantly. "You have to sign too, so it's official." Daniel knelt down to Emma's level, taking the crayon in his hand. The first time in decades he'd held anything other than expensive pens. As he signed his name next to hers, he felt something fundamental shift inside him, as if he was signing up for something much more significant than a 7-year-old's pretend legal document. The drive to Emma's neighborhood revealed a Chicago that existed in stark contrast to Daniel's world of glass towers and marble lobbies. They passed rows of boarded-up storefronts, their windows covered with plywood that bore the scars of countless storms and human struggles. Homeless camps sprouted under highway overpasses like urban mushrooms, their blue tarps and cardboard walls creating temporary cities that most of Chicago preferred to pretend didn't exist. Emma provided commentary with the innocence of someone who had never known a different reality. "That's where the nice police officer works," she said, pointing to a community station with bars on its windows. "Officer Martinez sometimes gives me and Tommy crackers when Mama's working late." "And that's the church where we go when it gets really cold. They let families sleep on the floor if they promise not to make noise." Daniel found himself absorbing details he'd never noticed despite driving through these neighborhoods thousands of times in the backseat of his company car. Children played in vacant lots where broken glass caught streetlight like deadly diamonds. Elderly people sat on stoops despite the rain, as if even a soaked porch was preferable to whatever waited inside their cramped apartments. "This is where I live," Emma announced as they pulled up to what appeared to be an abandoned gas station. Daniel looked around, confused, seeing only a boarded-up building and an empty lot scattered with debris. "I don't see a house," Daniel said carefully. Emma pointed to the back of the lot, where Daniel now noticed a small structure that had once been the station's service garage. Mama converted it into an apartment. "It's really nice inside. She painted flowers on the walls and everything." The apartment was a single room, barely large enough for Daniel's walk-in closet. But as Emma had promised, it was transformed by Sarah's determination to create a home from nothing. Hand-painted murals of gardens and meadows covered cinder-block walls. Furniture constructed from milk crates and plywood created distinct areas. A kitchen corner with a hot plate and mini refrigerator, a sleeping area with mattresses on the floor, and a tiny space designated as Tommy's nursery. Sarah Carter emerged from behind a curtain that served as the bedroom divider, carrying an 18-month-old boy whose labored breathing was audible from across the room. At 29, she possessed the kind of beauty that poverty couldn't diminish, high cheekbones and expressive eyes that spoke of intelligence and strength. But those same eyes held a wariness that came from too much experience with disappointment. "Emma Marie Carter, where have you been?" Sarah's voice carried the sharp edge of maternal fear mixed with relief. "I told you to stay inside when it started raining. You're soaked through and I can't afford for you to get sick." "Mama, I found someone to help us with Tommy's medicine," Emma announced proudly, gesturing toward Daniel. "This is Mr. Daniel. He's really rich and he signed a contract to let me pay him back when I grow up." Sarah's expression shifted instantly from relief to suspicion as she took in Daniel's expensive suit and polished appearance. Her grip tightened protectively around Tommy, who continued to wheeze with each breath. "What do you want?" Sarah asked bluntly, her voice carrying the hard edge of someone who'd learned that kindness from strangers usually came with strings attached. "I brought Tommy's medicine," Daniel said, holding up the pharmacy bag. Emma explained that he needed it tonight. "Nothing's free," Sarah replied, her eyes never leaving Daniel's face. "Rich men don't help people like us unless they want something in return." "What's your angle?" Emma stepped between them, her small voice carrying surprising authority. "Mama, he's not like the others. He listened to me. He didn't call security or pretend he couldn't hear me. And he signed my contract. See?" She pulled out the crayon-decorated paper, now slightly damp from the rain. Sarah glanced at the contract, and for a moment her expression softened at her daughter's earnest attempt to formalize their arrangement. But the wariness quickly returned as she studied Daniel with the calculating gaze of someone who'd survived by reading people's true intentions. "I appreciate the gesture," Sarah said carefully, "but we'll find another way. We always do." Tommy chose that moment to have a coughing fit that shook his tiny frame and left him gasping for air. Sarah immediately shifted into crisis mode, tilting him forward and rubbing his back with practiced efficiency, but Daniel could see the panic in her eyes as Tommy's breathing became increasingly labored. "Please," Daniel said quietly, "let me help. No strings, no expectations. Just let me help." "Why?" Sarah's question came out as almost a whisper, her focus still on Tommy's breathing. Daniel looked around the tiny space that Sarah had somehow transformed into a home, at the hand-painted flowers that bloomed impossibly on concrete walls, at Emma's artwork carefully displayed with Scotch tape, at the medical equipment Sarah had somehow acquired to monitor Tommy's condition. He saw a family that had lost everything except their love for each other. "Because 37 years ago, I was 8 years old and living in a car with my parents after my dad lost his job," Daniel said, the words coming from a place he'd kept sealed for decades. "The night my parents died in that accident, we were parked outside a hospital because my mother was too proud to go to the emergency room without insurance. Maybe if someone had helped us that night, just helped without asking questions or demanding explanations, they'd still be alive." Sarah stared at him, Tommy's breathing gradually stabilizing in her arms. "You lived in a car?" "For 3 months. I remember counting change for food, remember my parents arguing about whether we could afford my mother's heart medication. I remember promising God that if we could just have a real home again, I'd never take anything for granted." Daniel's voice caught slightly. "I forgot that promise somewhere along the way." Emma moved to stand beside Daniel, slipping her small hand into his much larger one. "See, Mama, he understands about promises." Sarah looked at her daughter, then at Tommy, then back at Daniel. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of rain against the converted garage's metal roof and Tommy's gradually improving breathing. "If you're lying," Sarah said finally, "if this is some kind of game or publicity stunt or tax write-off, I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of man you really are." "I understand," Daniel replied. "And if you disappear tomorrow and break my daughter's heart, I'll hunt you down myself." "I understand that, too." Sarah hesitated for another long moment, then slowly reached for the pharmacy bag. "Tommy needs his breathing treatment now." "You can stay while I give it to him, but after that, you go back to your world and we go back to ours." But as Sarah prepared Tommy's medicine with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd become an expert in her child's medical needs, as Emma chattered excitedly about the electric car and the kind pharmacist, and as Tommy's breathing finally began to ease after receiving his medication, Daniel realized that going back to his world might not be as simple as any of them imagined. Emma curled up next to Daniel on the makeshift couch, her damp clothes finally beginning to dry from the space heater's warmth. "Mr. Daniel," she whispered, "are you going to keep your promise to let me pay you back?" "Every promise should be kept," Daniel replied, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in years. "Good," Emma said with satisfaction, "because I keep all my promises." "Mama taught me that promises are the most important thing you can give someone, because they're the only thing that money can't buy." Over the following 6 weeks, Daniel Morrison's carefully structured life began to unravel in ways he never could have anticipated. What started as a single act of charity evolved into something that defied every principle he'd used to build his empire. Each evening after work, instead of returning to his empty penthouse, he found himself driving to the converted garage on the south side, carrying groceries, medicine refills, or small gifts that Emma treasured like precious artifacts. The routine began innocently enough. Daniel would check on Tommy's breathing, ensure they had adequate supplies, and leave within an hour. But Emma's gravitational pull proved stronger than his emotional defenses. She would insist on showing him her latest drawings, explaining her elaborate games with bottle caps and cardboard boxes, or reading to him from library books she'd memorized because she couldn't bear to return them. "Look, Mr. Daniel," Emma announced during his second week of visits, presenting a hand-drawn chart covered in careful tick marks. "I'm keeping track of everything you give us, so I know exactly how much to pay you back. So far, you've spent $247.38 on our family." The precision of her accounting struck Daniel as both heartbreaking and impressive. While he casually spent more on a single dinner than Emma's family lived on for a month, she tracked every purchase with the diligence of a corporate auditor. Sarah's resistance gradually softened as Daniel proved his consistency. She began accepting his help with the wary gratitude of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment but desperately needed hope. Her conversations evolved from suspicious interrogation to cautious sharing, revealing fragments of the life that had brought her to this converted garage. "I used to be an ICU nurse at Chicago General," Sarah confided during his third week of visits while preparing Tommy's evening medications with practiced efficiency. "I loved that job, helping families through their worst moments, being the person who could explain what the doctors really meant when they used all those medical terms." "What happened?" Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer would involve the same systemic failures that had shaped his own childhood. "I discovered that several board members were manipulating insurance claims, denying coverage to patients who desperately needed treatment while approving unnecessary procedures for wealthy donors. When I refused to falsify medical records to support their scheme, they fired me and made sure I'd never work in another hospital in Chicago." The cruelty of Sarah's situation became clear as she continued her story. Her husband Jake had developed the same respiratory condition that now threatened Tommy, but the hospital where Sarah had worked, the place where she'd dedicated years of her life to saving others, had denied him treatment because he lacked adequate insurance. "Jake died in our apartment, struggling to breathe because the emergency room turned him away twice," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was a trained medical professional, but I couldn't save my own husband because the system I'd served had decided his life wasn't worth the cost of treatment." Daniel felt a familiar rage building in his chest. Not the calculated anger he used to demolish competitors, but the raw fury of someone who understood how institutions could crush individuals with bureaucratic indifference. His own parents had died because they couldn't afford his mother's heart medication, victims of the same system that had now claimed Jake and threatened Tommy. Emma, who seemed to absorb adult conversations with uncomfortable sophistication, climbed into Daniel's lap while her mother recounted these painful memories. "That's why I have to be really good at math," she explained seriously. "Someone has to make sure we have enough money for Tommy's medicine, and Mama gets too sad to think about numbers sometimes." The weight of responsibility this 7-year-old carried struck Daniel like a physical blow. Emma had been forced to become the family's financial planner, medical coordinator, and emotional support system, roles that would challenge most adults, yet she approached them with matter-of-fact competence. During his 4th week of visits, Daniel began experiencing symptoms he attributed to workplace stress: persistent headaches, occasional dizziness, and moments of disorientation that made him grip his desk until the sensation passed. His assistant Helen expressed concern about his increasing absence from important meetings, but Daniel found himself unable to focus on quarterly projections when Emma's latest drawing showed their family as stick figures holding hands outside a real house. "She drew you, too," Sarah observed, pointing to a tall figure in what appeared to be a business suit. "You're in all her family pictures now." The implications of Emma's artistic inclusion unsettled Daniel more than any corporate crisis he'd faced. He'd spent 40 years avoiding emotional entanglements, yet a 7-year-old had somehow designated him as family without his consent or conscious participation. The situation grew more complex when Daniel's background investigation into Sarah's firing revealed connections to Marcus Blackwood, a former business partner who'd lost everything when Daniel had orchestrated a hostile takeover of his company 10 years earlier. Marcus had been one of the board members involved in the insurance fraud scheme that had cost Sarah her job and Jake his life. Marcus Blackwood's fall from grace had been spectacular and personal. The buyout had not only bankrupted his company, but had also contributed to his wife's suicide and his daughter's decision to cut all contact with him. Daniel had justified the aggressive acquisition as sound business strategy, never considering the human casualties of his corporate warfare. Now, Marcus's connection to Sarah's family created a moral complexity that Daniel struggled to navigate. His success had indirectly contributed to the system that had destroyed Sarah's career and Jake's life, making his current charity feel less like generosity and more like inadequate restitution. Emma remained blissfully unaware of these adult complications, continuing to treat Daniel with the uncomplicated affection that children reserve for people they trust completely. She began calling him Uncle Danny without permission, creating moments of awkward tenderness that left Daniel emotionally off balance. "Uncle Danny, will you read me a story?" Emma asked during his 5th week of visits, presenting a worn library book about a family of bears who learned to overcome their differences through love and patience. As Daniel read about fictional bears resolving their conflicts through communication and mutual support, he realized he was experiencing something he'd never known: the simple pleasure of being needed for reasons that had nothing to do with money, power, or strategic advantage. Emma listened with rapt attention, occasionally interrupting to explain why certain story elements reminded her of their real-life situation. Tommy's development during this period provided another source of unexpected joy. The 18-month-old began recognizing Daniel's voice, reaching for him when he entered their small living space, and babbling in ways that Sarah interpreted as attempts at communication. "He's trying to say, 'Danny,'" Sarah announced during week 6, as Tommy reached toward Daniel with chubby arms and produced sounds that might charitably be interpreted as consonants. "You're the first man he's really responded to since Jake died." The progression of Daniel's involvement accelerated when Tommy's condition suddenly deteriorated. The medication that had been managing his symptoms began losing effectiveness, and his breathing became increasingly labored despite consistent treatment. Emergency room visits became more frequent, and each crisis brought the family closer to a devastating reality. Tommy needed surgery that would cost $85,000. The doctors say we have maybe 6 weeks before his airway becomes completely compromised, Sarah explained, her professional nursing knowledge making the prognosis even more terrifying. Without the surgery, he'll suffocate. With the surgery, he has a 90% chance of living a completely normal life. Emma's response to this news demonstrated the heartbreaking maturity that poverty had forced upon her. She immediately began calculating ways to raise the money, suggesting they sell everything they owned, that she could get a job helping neighbors, or that they could move to a cheaper place and use the difference toward Tommy's medical costs. "I could stop going to school and work full-time," Emma announced with 7-year-old logic. "Lots of kids don't go to school, and Tommy needs the surgery more than I need to learn about reading and math." The casual way Emma offered to sacrifice her education and childhood for her brother's survival created the crisis that would test every relationship Daniel had built over the past 6 weeks. Sarah's pride warred with maternal desperation. Emma's determination to contribute clashed with the reality of child labor laws, and Daniel faced a choice that would define not only Tommy's future, but his own capacity for genuine selflessness. As the deadline for Tommy's surgery approached, Daniel realized that all his wealth meant nothing if he couldn't find a way to help that preserved Sarah's dignity, honored Emma's need to contribute, and saved Tommy's life without destroying the fragile trust they'd built together. The 72-hour countdown began on a Wednesday morning when Tommy's breathing became so labored that Sarah rushed him to Chicago General's emergency room, the same hospital that had once employed her and later denied her husband treatment. The attending physician, Dr. Patricia Williams, delivered the devastating news with clinical precision that barely masked her own frustration with the system. "Tommy's airway is closing faster than we anticipated," Dr. Williams explained, her eyes moving between Sarah's stricken face and the monitors tracking Tommy's vital signs. "We need to perform the corrective surgery within 3 days, or his condition will become irreversible. After that point, even surgery won't save him." Sarah held Tommy against her chest, feeling each of his struggled breaths like physical blows. "I don't have $85,000. I don't have insurance. I've applied for every charity program, every emergency fund, every assistance program in the city." "I understand," Dr. Williams said quietly, "but the hospital board requires payment guarantees before scheduling elective surgery, and they've classified Tommy's procedure as elective since he's not currently in immediate cardiac arrest." The cruel irony wasn't lost on Sarah. The same institution that had destroyed her career now held her son's life hostage behind financial barriers. Emma stood beside her mother's chair, her small hand resting on Tommy's back, as if she could somehow transfer her own healthy breathing to her struggling brother. Daniel received Sarah's frantic phone call while sitting in a board meeting reviewing quarterly projections that suddenly seemed obscenely irrelevant. He left his executives mid-sentence, ignoring their calls as he rushed from Morrison Tower to the hospital, his mind racing through financial solutions that Sarah's pride would never accept. "I can pay for the surgery," Daniel offered the moment he arrived in the pediatric waiting room, but Sarah's response was immediate and absolute. "No, I won't have my children thinking they're charity cases. We'll find another way." Her voice carried the steel of someone who had survived too much to compromise her dignity, even with her son's life hanging in the balance. Emma looked up from the coloring book a nurse had given her, her 7-year-old logic cutting through adult complexities with devastating clarity. "Mama, if Tommy dies because we don't have money, how is that better than Tommy living because Mr. Daniel helps us?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, forcing all 3 adults to confront the moral mathematics of pride versus survival. Sarah's face crumpled as she struggled between her fierce independence and her maternal instincts. "You don't understand, baby," Sarah whispered to Emma. "Once you start taking that kind of money from people, they own you. They can decide when to help and when to stop helping. They can take it all away whenever they want." Daniel felt the weight of Sarah's words, understanding that her resistance came from experience with systems that had repeatedly failed her. But as Tommy's breathing became increasingly labored over the next day, the philosophical debate about independence versus dependence became a brutal countdown toward irreversible loss. Thursday brought no solutions. Sarah spent hours on the phone with charity organizations that offered sympathy but no funding, with insurance companies that cited pre-existing condition clauses, and with medical loan companies that demanded collateral she didn't possess. Emma sat beside Tommy's hospital crib, reading to him from picture books and singing lullabies in a voice that occasionally cracked with exhaustion. "The bears in the story always find a way to solve their problems," Emma told Tommy during one of his calmer moments. "We just have to be as smart as the bears." Daniel watched this scene through the room's window, his own helplessness more frustrating than any corporate crisis he'd ever faced. His billions meant nothing if Sarah's pride prevented him from using them to save Tommy. He understood her position. Accepting his money would create a dependency that could be withdrawn at any time, leaving them more vulnerable than before. Friday morning brought the final ultimatum. Dr. Williams found them in the family conference room, her expression grave as she delivered news that everyone had been dreading. "Tommy's oxygen saturation is dropping despite maximum medical support," she explained. "We need to take him to surgery today or we'll lose our window completely. I've spoken with the hospital administrator and they're willing to perform the surgery if we have a financial guarantee by noon." Sarah looked at the clock showing 9:47 a.m., then at Emma, who was holding Tommy and humming softly to keep him calm. The mathematics were brutal and simple: 2 hours and 13 minutes to find $85,000 or watch her son suffocate slowly over the coming weeks. "There has to be something," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some program I haven't found, some option I haven't considered." Emma looked up from Tommy, her young face carrying a wisdom that no 7-year-old should possess. "Mama, remember what you always tell me about promises? That keeping them is more important than anything else?" "Yes, baby, promises are sacred." "Well, I promised Mr. Daniel I would pay him back when I grow up. That means if he helps Tommy now, I have to keep working hard in school so I can get a good job and honor my promise. It means the money isn't free, it's borrowed against my future." The simplicity of Emma's logic cut through every adult complexity surrounding pride, charity, and dependence. She had reframed Daniel's offer not as charity, but as a loan secured by her own future earning potential and moral character. Sarah stared at her daughter, seeing not just a child, but a person capable of making binding commitments and understanding their implications. "You're 7 years old, Emma. You can't sign contracts or make financial promises." "But I can make real promises," Emma replied. "And real promises are worth more than contracts anyway, right? You taught me that." Daniel knelt beside Emma's chair, meeting her eyes at her level. "Are you sure you want to make this promise? It's a very big responsibility." "I'm sure," Emma said, with the gravity of someone making a life-altering decision. "Tommy needs to live so he can make his own promises someday. And you need us to be your family, even if you don't know it yet." The hospital clock showed 10:15 a.m. when Sarah finally nodded, tears streaming down her face as she accepted that sometimes love required swallowing pride. "Okay. But Emma signs the papers too. If we're doing this as a family, we all take responsibility." As Daniel called his banker to arrange an immediate wire transfer, Emma carefully wrote out a new contract on the back of her coloring book page. "I, Emma Carter, promise to pay Uncle Danny back for saving Tommy's life. I will study hard, get a good job, And never forget that promises are the most important things in the world. Tommy was wheeled into surgery at 11:43 a.m., 17 minutes before the hospital's deadline, his small hand clutching a stuffed bear that Emma had insisted would help him breathe better during the operation. Tommy's surgery lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes, each second stretching into an eternity for the three adults who had somehow become a family in the hospital's sterile waiting room. Sarah paced the linoleum floors with mechanical precision, her nursing background making her hyper-aware of every code announcement over the intercom, every urgent footstep in the corridors. Emma sat curled in Daniel's lap, alternating between periods of anxious chatter and exhausted silence, while Daniel found himself experiencing a kind of fear he'd never known, not the calculated risk of business ventures, but the raw terror of potentially losing someone who mattered more than profit margins. Dr. Williams emerged from the operating room at 3:47 p.m., her surgical mask pulled down to reveal an expression of cautious optimism mixed with professional exhaustion. "The surgery went very well," she announced, and Sarah's knees nearly buckled with relief. "We were able to reconstruct Tommy's airway completely. His breathing should be normal within a few days, and there's no reason he can't live a completely healthy life." Emma jumped up from Daniel's lap, her face bright with the kind of joy that only children can express without reservation. "Tommy's going to be okay. He's going to grow up and make promises just like me." But even as they celebrated Tommy's successful surgery, Daniel was fighting a private battle with symptoms he'd been ignoring for weeks. The persistent headaches had intensified during the surgical wait, and moments of disorientation made him grip his chair to maintain balance. He attributed the symptoms to stress, but a deeper part of his consciousness recognized something more sinister at work. The recovery room reunion was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Tommy lay connected to various monitors, his tiny chest rising and falling with the regular rhythm that had been absent for months. When he opened his eyes and saw his family surrounding his bed, he smiled, the first genuine smile they'd seen from him in weeks, unencumbered by the struggle for breath that had defined his short life. "Look how easy it is for him to breathe," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son's peaceful sleep. "I'd forgotten what it looked like when he wasn't fighting for air." Emma climbed carefully onto the hospital bed, positioning herself next to Tommy with the protective instincts of someone who'd spent months worrying about her brother's survival. "Tommy, you don't have to work so hard to breathe anymore. Now you can save your energy for learning to talk and walk and play." Over the next 3 days, as Tommy's recovery progressed beyond all medical expectations, Daniel's own health began a precipitous decline. The headaches became debilitating, and episodes of dizziness forced him to excuse himself from conversations to regain his equilibrium. Helen, his assistant, noticed his increasing pallor and occasional confusion during phone calls, but Daniel dismissed her concerns as workplace stress. The truth revealed itself on Tommy's 4th day of recovery, when Daniel collapsed in the hospital parking garage while walking to his car. Security cameras captured him falling unconscious beside his Tesla, and hospital staff rushed him to the emergency room where Tommy had been treated days earlier. The battery of tests that followed painted a devastating picture. Daniel had an aggressive brain tumor that had been growing for months, possibly years. The stress of the past few weeks had accelerated its effects, and Dr. Michael Harrison, the hospital's chief neurologist, delivered a prognosis that shattered any illusions about medical miracles. "The tumor is inoperable due to its location near critical brain structures," Dr. Harrison explained to Sarah and Emma, who had refused to leave Daniel's bedside despite the medical team's suggestions that children shouldn't be present for such discussions. "We're looking at 3 to 6 months, possibly less given how rapidly it's progressing." Emma's response to this news demonstrated the heartbreaking wisdom that trauma had forced upon her young life. Instead of crying or denying the reality, She climbed into Daniel's hospital bed and took his hand with the same gentle determination she'd shown when caring for Tommy. "Uncle Danny," she said quietly, "does this mean you're going to heaven like my daddy did?" Daniel struggled to find words that could explain mortality to a 7-year-old without destroying her faith in promises and happy endings. "It might, sweetheart. The doctors say I'm very sick." "But you can't die yet," Emma replied with the absolute conviction that children bring to impossible situations. "I haven't paid you back for saving Tommy." "If you die, I'll break my promise. And you taught me that promises are the most important things in the world." The cruel irony of Daniel's situation became clear over the following days. He had finally found a family worth living for at the precise moment he discovered he was dying. The man who had spent 40 years accumulating wealth he couldn't take with him now faced leaving behind the people who had taught him that wealth's true value lay in its ability to protect those you love. Sarah's response to Daniel's diagnosis revealed depths of compassion that humbled him completely. Despite her own exhaustion from Tommy's recovery and Emma's emotional needs, she appointed herself Daniel's primary advocate, researching experimental treatments, seeking second opinions, and navigating insurance complexities with the same fierce determination she'd shown in fighting for her children's lives. "You saved my son," she told Daniel during one of his clearer moments. "Now let me try to save you." The hospital became their temporary home, with Tommy recovering in the pediatric wing while Daniel began aggressive treatment in the oncology department. Emma divided her time between both patients, reading stories to Tommy and drawing pictures for Daniel that showed all of them together in various happy scenarios. At parks, in houses with actual bedrooms, celebrating birthdays and holidays that might never come. Emma's artwork during this period revealed a child's desperate attempt to will reality into conforming to her vision of how families should work. Her drawings always included 4 figures: herself, Tommy, Sarah, and Daniel, living in houses with windows and doors, eating meals around tables, playing in yards with swing sets and flowers. The pictures represented not just artistic expression, but architectural plans for a future that medical science suggested was impossible. The most devastating revelation came during Daniel's second week of treatment, when Marcus Blackwood appeared in Daniel's hospital room like a specter from his corporate past. Marcus had aged badly in the 10 years since Daniel's hostile takeover had destroyed his company, his face bearing the lines of someone who had lost everything that mattered and spent years planning revenge. "I heard you'd found yourself a little charity project," Marcus said, his voice carrying the bitter satisfaction of someone who believed justice was finally being served. "Funny how life works out, isn't it? You destroy my family, and now you get to watch yours fall apart too." Daniel was too weak to respond with his usual corporate aggression, but Emma, who had been coloring quietly in the corner, looked up at Marcus with the kind of direct gaze that made adults uncomfortable. "Are you the man who made my mama lose her job at the hospital?" Emma asked with 7-year-old directness. "Because if you are, you're the reason my daddy couldn't get medicine when he got sick like Tommy." Marcus's expression shifted as he realized this child understood connections that most adults preferred to ignore. The little girl staring at him represented the human cost of his corporate revenge against Daniel, innocent casualties in a war between powerful men who had forgotten that their decisions affected real families. "I didn't mean for people to get hurt," Marcus said, his voice losing its vengeful edge as he faced Emma's unwavering stare. "But they did get hurt," Emma replied simply. "My daddy died and Tommy almost died, and now Uncle Danny is sick too. When grown-ups fight with each other, kids are the ones who get hurt the most." The truth of Emma's words hung in the hospital room like an indictment of every adult decision that prioritized pride, profit, or revenge over human welfare. Marcus left without another word, but his visit had accomplished something he hadn't intended. It had revealed the broader web of cause and effect that connected Daniel's corporate success to the very tragedies he was now trying to heal. As Daniel's condition continued to deteriorate despite aggressive treatment, the family faced the most difficult conversations of their lives, planning for futures that might not include the person who had brought them together. The miracle began with Emma's blood test on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide Daniel's life into before and after. Dr. Harrison had ordered routine blood work for all family members, hoping to identify potential bone marrow donors who might slow Daniel's tumor progression through experimental stem cell therapy. The results, delivered with the careful precision that doctors reserve for news too important to misinterpret, changed everything they thought they knew about their family. "Emma is a perfect genetic match for Daniel," Dr. Harrison announced, his voice carrying a mixture of professional excitement and human amazement. "This level of compatibility occurs in roughly 1 in 10 million cases, typically only seen between identical twins or parent and child." Sarah stared at the test results, her medical training helping her understand the implications, while her heart struggled to process what her mind had already grasped. "That's not possible. Daniel isn't Emma's father. Her father was my husband Jake, and he died 2 years ago." But even as Sarah spoke the words, memories began surfacing that she'd buried beneath grief and survival. A hospital charity gala 3 years earlier, where she'd met a keynote speaker whose personal story of childhood poverty had resonated with her own struggles. A shared conversation about lost parents and impossible dreams. A single night of connection between two people who understood loneliness in ways that couldn't be explained to anyone who hadn't lived it. Emma, sitting cross-legged on Daniel's hospital bed, looked between the adults with the intuitive wisdom that children possess when adults are dancing around truths too complicated for direct conversation. "Does this mean Uncle Danny is my real daddy?" "Because Tommy doesn't look like the daddy in the pictures. But I always thought maybe I looked a little bit like Uncle Danny around the eyes." The silence that followed Emma's observation carried the weight of 3 years of carefully constructed assumptions crumbling in the face of genetic evidence. Sarah's face went through a progression of emotions: shock, recognition, guilt, and finally a kind of resigned acceptance of a truth she'd known but never acknowledged. "Sarah," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible above the medical equipment's steady beeping. "Is it possible?" Sarah closed her eyes, the careful walls she'd built around that night finally giving way to honesty. "Jake and I were separated when I met you at the hospital gala. We didn't reconcile until a month later, and Emma was born 8 months after that. I knew there was a possibility, but Jake loved her so completely that it never seemed to matter who her biological father was." The revelation recontextualized every interaction between Daniel and Emma over the past 2 months. Her instant trust in him, her insistence on including him in her family drawings, her uncanny ability to understand his childhood trauma, all of it now carried the deeper significance of genetic recognition and biological connection. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat, redirecting their attention to medical possibilities rather than emotional complexities. "The genetic compatibility means Emma's stem cells could potentially halt the tumor's progression and possibly reverse some of the damage. But the procedure carries risks for Emma, and she would need to undergo several rounds of treatment over the coming months." Emma's response was immediate and absolute. "I want to help Daddy get better. I promised I would pay him back for saving Tommy, and this is how I can keep my promise." The word Daddy hung in the air like a prayer finally answered. Daniel felt tears streaming down his face as he reached for Emma's small hand, understanding for the first time in his life what it meant to love someone more than his own existence. "Sweetheart, you don't have to call me Daddy just because of what the blood test says," Daniel said gently. You can call me whatever feels right to you." Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important decisions. "I think I've been calling you Daddy in my heart for a while now. I just didn't know if it was okay to say it out loud." The stem cell treatments began the following week, with Emma approaching each procedure with the same matter-of-fact courage she'd shown throughout Tommy's crisis. She would sit in the treatment chair beside Daniel's hospital bed, holding his hand while machines extracted cells from her bone marrow, chattering about school and friends as if undergoing medical procedures to save her father's life was simply another item on her 7-year-old schedule. "Does it hurt?" Daniel asked during her second treatment session, watching his daughter's face for signs of discomfort she might be hiding. "A little bit," Emma admitted, "but not as much as it hurt when Tommy couldn't breathe, and not as much as it would hurt if you went to heaven before I could show you all the things I want us to do together." Sarah watched these exchanges with a mixture of wonder and maternal protectiveness, seeing her daughter's capacity for selfless love while worrying about the emotional and physical toll of the treatments. She'd also begun processing her own feelings about Daniel's role in their lives. No longer the generous stranger who'd helped them through a crisis, but Emma's father and her own connection to a love she'd thought she'd lost forever. The corporate world that had once defined Daniel's existence began to fade in importance as he focused entirely on his daughter's treatments and his son's recovery. Tommy had been released from the hospital but required ongoing physical therapy to strengthen muscles that had been compromised by months of breathing difficulties. Emma split her time between her own medical treatments and helping Tommy with exercises that resembled games more than therapy. "Look, Daddy," Emma announced during one of Tommy's physical therapy sessions, using the word with increasing confidence and joy. "Tommy can walk all the way across the room without getting tired. He's going to be able to run and play like other kids." Daniel watched his children with the intense focus of someone who understood that time was precious and not guaranteed. Even as the stem cell treatments began showing promising results, reduced tumor size, improved cognitive function, stabilized symptoms, he remained acutely aware that tomorrow was never certain for anyone, sick or healthy. Marcus Blackwood's unexpected return to the hospital 3 weeks later brought the story full circle in ways none of them could have anticipated. This time, he didn't come seeking revenge or delivering threats. Instead, he carried flowers for Emma and a letter of resignation from every position he'd held in the corporate and medical establishments that had contributed to their family's suffering. "I spent 10 years planning how to destroy you," Marcus told Daniel, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd finally recognized the futility of revenge. "But watching that little girl risk her own health to save yours made me realize I'd become the kind of man who hurts children to punish their parents. That's not who I want to be anymore." Emma accepted Marcus's flowers with the graciousness that children show to adults who approach them with genuine respect. "Thank you for the flowers, Mr. Marcus. Are you going to stop being angry at my daddy now?" "Yes, Emma. I'm going to stop being angry and start trying to fix some of the things I broke when I was angry." Marcus's transformation included liquidating his remaining assets to establish a fund for families facing medical crises similar to what Sarah's family had endured. He also provided testimony that led to criminal investigations of the insurance fraud schemes that had cost Sarah her career and Jake his life. 6 months after Emma's first stem cell treatment, Daniel's latest brain scans showed no detectable tumor activity. Dr. Harrison, who had been treating cancer patients for 20 years, described the results as the most remarkable recovery he'd ever witnessed. "Medically, I can't fully explain what happened," Dr. Harrison admitted. "The stem cell treatments helped, but this level of recovery suggests factors beyond what current medical science can account for." Emma had her own explanation, delivered with the absolute certainty that children bring to matters of the heart. "Daddy got better because we became a real family." Sometimes when people have been sad and lonely for a really long time, finding their family can heal them in ways that medicines can't. As Daniel held his daughter while she spoke these words, he realized that Emma had been right about promises from the very beginning. She had promised to pay him back, and she had, not with money, but with the gift of discovering what it meant to be part of something larger and more valuable than individual success. The wedding took place 6 months later in the same hospital chapel where they had nearly lost each other, surrounded by the unlikely community that had formed around their story. Frank Rodriguez, the security guard who had first witnessed Emma's determination, served as Daniel's best man. Mrs. Chen, the pharmacist who had recognized a child's unwavering love, provided the flowers. Dr. Williams and Dr. Harrison stood among the guests, medical professionals who had learned that healing sometimes required more than clinical expertise. Emma, now 8 years old and officially Emma Morrison, had insisted on being both flower girl and ring bearer, arguing with irrefutable logic that since she had brought her parents together, she should have the most important jobs in their wedding ceremony. She wore a white dress that Daniel had bought her, the first new clothing she'd ever owned, and carried rings that symbolized promises she had always believed were possible. Sarah, radiant in a simple ivory dress, had returned to nursing through a program Daniel had funded for healthcare workers who had been blacklisted for ethical stands. Her first day back in an ICU had been emotional, but she'd discovered that surviving her own medical crisis had given her an even deeper capacity for helping families navigate their darkest moments. Tommy, now 2.5 years old, toddled down the aisle with the confident gait of a child whose breathing had never been compromised, his laughter filling the chapel with the sound of pure joy. He called Daniel Daddy with the unconscious ease of someone who had never known a world without that protection and love. Daniel stood at the altar in a suit that cost less than his old ties, but felt more valuable than any corporate acquisition he'd ever celebrated. His health had stabilized completely, defying every medical prediction and forcing Dr. Harrison to revise his understanding of what factors contributed to healing. The tumor remained undetectable, and Daniel's cognitive function had returned to levels that exceeded his pre-diagnosis baseline. "Dearly beloved," the chaplain began, but Emma interrupted with the confidence of someone who had opinions about important ceremonies. "Before they get married, can I say something? Because I want everyone to know why this is happening." The chaplain smiled and gestured for Emma to continue, recognizing that this family operated according to principles that transcended traditional protocols. Emma stepped forward, her voice carrying throughout the chapel with remarkable clarity. 3 years ago, I promised a stranger that I would pay him back for helping my family. I thought paying back meant money, but I learned that the most important promises aren't about money at all. They're about love and family and keeping your word even when it's hard. She looked directly at Daniel, her eyes shining with the wisdom that had been forced upon her young life, but had somehow remained untainted by cynicism. "Daddy, I promised to pay you back, and I did. I gave you me and Tommy and Mama, but you gave us something even more valuable. You showed us that promises work both ways. When people really love each other, they promise to take care of each other forever." The congregation sat in reverent silence as Emma continued, her words carrying the weight of truth that could only come from someone who had experienced profound loss and miraculous restoration. So today, when Mama and Daddy promise to love each other forever, they're really promising to keep being the kind of family where everybody takes care of everybody else, where nobody gets left behind, and where promises are the most important things in the world. Emma returned to her place, satisfied that she had properly explained the significance of the day. The ceremony continued with traditional vows that felt revolutionary in their simplicity. Two people who had found each other through their children's needs, promising to build a future based on the principles that a 7-year-old had taught them about the true nature of debt and payment. Morrison Digital Solutions, under Daniel's transformed leadership, had become a certified B Corporation focused on healthcare accessibility technology. The company's mission statement, written by Emma during one of her visits to Daniel's office, read, "Technology should help families stay together and healthy. Money is for solving problems, not creating them." The business transformation had been remarkably successful, attracting investors and employees who valued purpose alongside profit. Daniel's leadership style had evolved from corporate ruthlessness to collaborative problem-solving, and his company's stock price had actually increased as stakeholders recognized the sustainable value of ethical business practices. The reception was held in the hospital's Family Center, a space that had been renovated using funds from the viral fundraising campaign that Emma's story had inspired. Hundreds of families had contributed small amounts, creating a community resource for other parents facing medical crises with their children. Emma's story had indeed gone viral, but not in the way that corporate marketing campaigns typically achieved widespread attention. Instead, her simple faith in the power of promises had resonated with people across the country who remembered their own moments of desperate need and unexpected kindness. The fundraising had grown organically, driven by parents who recognized their own fears in Sarah's story and their own hopes in Emma's determination. Frank Rodriguez gave a speech that brought tears to everyone's eyes, describing how witnessing Emma's courage had reminded him why he had chosen to work in security, to protect people, not just property. Mrs. Chen spoke about the privilege of serving families who treated small kindnesses as miracles worth celebrating. Dr. Williams and Dr. Harrison addressed the medical aspects of the family's journey, acknowledging that healing often required factors that couldn't be measured in clinical studies. But the most memorable moment came when Tommy, inspired by all the adult speeches, climbed onto a chair and declared in his toddler voice, "I love my family. We all take care of each other." The simplicity of his statement captured everything that mattered about their story. Not the medical drama, not the corporate redemption, not even the remarkable coincidences that had brought them together, but the fundamental truth that families are created through commitment, care, and the daily choice to prioritize each other's well-being. As the evening progressed, Marcus Blackwood arrived unexpectedly, carrying a wrapped gift and an expression of nervous humility. His presence created a moment of tension, but Emma immediately walked over to him with the gracious confidence that had defined her approach to every adult complication in her young life. "Mr. Marcus, I'm glad you came to our wedding. Are you feeling better about not being angry anymore?" Marcus knelt down to Emma's level, his voice thick with emotion as he responded. "I'm feeling much better, Emma. And I brought you something. It's a promise jar like the one you used to have. But this one is for keeping promises instead of writing them." The gift was a beautiful glass jar with "Promises Kept" etched into its surface, and inside were colorful stones representing each promise that had been fulfilled during their journey together. Emma's promise to pay Daniel back, Daniel's promise to help their family, Sarah's promise to rebuild her career, Tommy's promise to get healthy, and Marcus's promise to stop letting anger control his choices. Emma hugged the jar to her chest, understanding immediately that promises kept were more valuable than promises made. "Thank you, Mr. Marcus. This is the most perfect present because it shows that grown-ups can learn to keep their promises just like kids do." The wedding concluded with Daniel and Sarah cutting a cake that Emma had helped design, a simple vanilla cake with strawberries that represented Tommy's first solid food after his surgery, and chocolate chips that represented Emma's favorite treat during their hospital stays. It wasn't elaborate or expensive, but it carried the sweetness of survival, recovery, and hope fulfilled. As guests began to leave, the new Morrison family gathered in the hospital room where their journey had really begun. Not the penthouse where Daniel had lived alone, not the garage where Sarah had struggled to survive, but the pediatric ward, where they had learned that love could literally save lives. Emma climbed into the hospital bed where Tommy had recovered from surgery, where Daniel had received his diagnosis, and where all of them had discovered that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought with money, but could be shared through promises, kept through commitment, and multiplied through the simple act of caring for each other. "We did it," Emma announced with satisfaction. "We kept all our promises, and now we're a real family forever." Daniel looked at his wife, his daughter, and his son, understanding finally that Emma had been right from the very beginning. Some promises are worth more than all the money in the world, and the most important debts are the ones we pay with love. Message for American seniors, 200 words. At 55, 60, or 65, many of us look back and wonder if we truly invested in what matters most. Daniel Morrison had everything the American dream promised: wealth, success, corporate power, yet he ate dinner alone every night, surrounded by achievements that couldn't fill the emptiness inside. Then, a 7-year-old girl with a crumpled dollar bill taught him that real riches aren't measured in bank accounts, but in people who care whether you come home. Emma's simple promise to "pay back when I grow up" revealed a profound truth many of us learned too late. The most valuable currency in life is love, time spent with family, and the connections that make us feel truly needed. This wasn't just about charity or helping the poor. It was about discovering that wealth without relationships is just expensive loneliness. As we enter our golden years, we face the same choice Daniel did: continue accumulating what we can't take with us, or invest in the relationships that give life its deepest meaning. Sometimes it takes a child's wisdom to remind us that the richest people aren't those with the most money, but those with the most love. Discussion questions. What moment in your life taught you the difference between financial success and true fulfillment? Have you ever experienced unexpected kindness that changed your perspective on what really matters? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else who needs to hear it.